My dad died at the end of 20 in December. In the last 24 hours, they let us in to hold his hand. And of course, he's unconscious at that point. But we missed all of the rites of passage, literally, to shepherd him in his dying. And I would say myself and my mother and my sister were developmentally hurt and blocked by that because we didn't have that opportunity. So when we not only don't offer but we take them away as a society, super dangerous.
This is Andrew Petty is Dying, where we tap into the power of our mortality to become the people we were made to be and live the lives we were made to live. I'm your host, Andrew Petty, and I'm dying. I hate to say it, but so are you. What place do rites of passage have in your life? In this episode, my special guest is my coach, Amy Musson, and we explore why rites of passage matter and the surprisingly harmful consequences of neglecting them. It turns out that there's more at stake than you might have thought, if you've ever given rites of passage much thought at all. If you haven't given them much thought, then you're not alone. I think most of us in the materially affluent Western world today have largely neglected meaningful rites of passage. Emphasis on, quote, materially affluent, by the way, because, as Amy and I discuss in this conversation, we affluent Westerners are perhaps quite impoverished in other less tangible but vitally important areas. I hadn't given rites of passage much thought until recently, as my oldest son approached his 13th year. Then, a couple months ago, Amy and I had a coaching conversation that led us to stumble upon the importance of rites of passage in a fresh way that had immediate value for both of us. It's out of that coaching conversation that the idea for today's conversation was born. That's one of the things that I love about coaching conversations. At their core, they are creative exchanges that generate fresh insight and create new depths of understanding. And that's what I invite you into today, a very candid continuation of a creative exchange about rites of passage that Amy and I began a couple months ago, a creative exchange that made an impact in both of our lives. I hope it will spark your own curiosity and creativity around rites of passage and make an impact in your life too. Amy and I met almost 2 years ago when we were both members of an online forum created by Ozan Varol, an author I've mentioned in previous episodes whose book, Think Like a Rocket Scientist, entered my life at just the right time, as books can do. Long story short, Amy and I recognized that we each had something to offer the other, and we struck up a peer coaching partnership that's been going strong ever since. We alternate coaching each other on a weekly basis. Our partnership has been one of the most influential and transformative I've ever experienced, personally and professionally. Amy is an innately gifted coach, with vast amounts of training, experience, and wisdom to boot, and an ever-evolving array of offerings. In fact, it was her podcast, The Growth Moment, that triggered a revelation for me about unexpressed grief and led to newfound freedom. I'll include details about how to connect with Amy in the show notes for this episode. We enter the conversation today when Amy is describing a recent experience with her son that ultimately led to our discussion of rites of passage. Let's jump in.
So, of course, we're coaching, and I think it's going to be about my business, and then it ends up being about my real business, my boy, my 16-year-old. It came out because he had just gotten not his learner's, but his actual driver's license. And off he went, and I waved goodbye. And then you and I coached on the utter devastation that I felt and the unexpected. I knew I'd be scared, worried, nervous about him driving off, the danger, the safety issue. I had completely not counted on, was blindsided by the grief, the shift, the transition. And I think I likened it to when I stopped carrying him around because he could walk. It was an unexpected, complete shift. But with the walking, there was so much excitement about his walking. There wasn't really the grief. But this, all of a sudden, I realized that my whole role had changed in an instant. He no longer needs me to drive him around. He no longer looks to be shuttled and carried, if you will. It was a fundamental step into his adulthood I was just so focused on the process of getting that license and, oh, he can drive himself to school now. No one had prepared or ever talked about that I might feel an emotional tectonic shift into, oh, this is all changed now. And that led us to talking about, wow, that's a real rite of passage. And I'm like, God, there should have been a ceremony of handing of the keys and maybe filming the first drive, and all of us having a chance to talk about, what does this mean? Who are you now? Who are we now? What's the relationship now? What's his place, not only in our family, but a little bit in society as a, quote, driver and owner of himself. So yeah, I think that was the genesis of our coaching that day.
And I remember being struck by just its impact on you. I'm accustomed to thinking of rites of passage as something that is primarily for the initiate, for the person making the transition. And it was clear that you were undergoing your own transition. And that really stuck with me. And I'm curious, it's been a couple months now, I guess. Is that right? A couple months since that conversation?
Mm-hmm.
What has transpired for you internally and emotionally, and as he's made this transition and is now an independent driver on his own? What's the new reality like for you?
The first thing that comes up is not, I'll speak to that in a moment, but if we had not coached on it that day, if I had not had the space to process the transition, to name it, to unpack it a bit, and to honor the grief, if you will, the shift, the relational aspect of the passage, if you will. If I had not had a space and an opportunity to do that day, I think it would have bled out, into unintended impact in our relationship with my son. I probably would have gone around feeling heavy and out of sorts and out of body even, without knowing why. So that's the first thing that comes up, is why these freaking rites of passage have been with us for thousands of years, because actually we can't develop as humans. We can't move into next stages fully. We can't have access to our full self without. So you ended up being, part of helping, being my unexpected Sherpa or guide in that rite of passage for me as a mother, as a parent. So that was a really big piece. So that transpired because I left that session really pondering, and I talked about what came up with several people, my son, my husband, my sister, some other mothers. But most importantly, I felt processed afterwards. I felt lighter. I felt integrated, and hence had more to bring then to this new phase that would have been blocked otherwise.
You were able to be an active participant in his transition, as opposed to a reluctant participant or someone who was unconsciously holding him back from making that transition.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that I served as sort of a catalyst in that moment, and I hadn't considered before something that may be plenty obvious to groups that have distinct rites of passage, and there are many cultures around the world that do. Our modern Western culture just seems to be lacking in many respects. But the importance of a celebrant or a third party to help those involved make that transition.
The priest, the rabbi, the shaman,
right,
the MC at a quinceanera, whatever.
Because left to our own devices, we simply might not do it, even if we acknowledge the value of it. And in fact, I'm kind of facing that conundrum with my 12-year-old, soon to be 13-year-old. And well that ever since, actually for about a year now, I've been very interested in having some sort of rite of passage for him in his 13th year. Transition into young manhood and into more responsibility and all those kinds of things. But I have been so stuck trying to figure out what to do and how to do it. And maybe that's part of why the celebrant or the officiant or the whomever is there helping the people involved do it is so essential.
Well, and then if we think of rites of passage, a wedding ceremony is humongous rite of passage. And we think of it just as, here are the vows or here's the celebration, but it really does. You have a celebrant, and the witnesses as well, I think, are important to the rite of passage. And even in a sense that was missing for my son. It was a it was a rite of passage, but no celebrant, no ceremony, no witness.
If you count DMV as a celebrant, maybe that works, but it's usually a fairly dry experience. So,
but I mean, think about what it could be, even that piece. And I think, I think we're missing, and for whatever reason, it's making me think of actually giving birth to Matt. And that is a rite of passage, and there is a process, and there's a celebrant in the form of the midwife or the doctor, or and there certainly are some witnesses, but even that, right in that moment, could be so deepened by, and I think a lot of postpartum depression could be softened or utilized better, because there isn't the postmortem of the process. You just are thrown into baby care, as opposed to, hey, how was that for you? Mom, dad, or whatever combination of, moms and dads and partners, and
right,
of what just happened here.
My goodness. Yeah. I mean, you go from being a woman to being another kind of woman, a mother, which I would conjecture is an entirely different kind of womanhood than you were just moments before. And I can't imagine the whole person impact, emotional, spiritual, psychological, and everything that goes
unprocessed.
Right.
You just rush into sleeplessness and nervousness and care and love and overwhelming emotions. Prior civilizations, generations did a much better job at ritualizing.
That was exactly the word I was thinking. Yeah. And we've, the word I want to use as the counterpart to ritualize is we've sterilized those moments.
Oh, yes.
Not just the birth moment, but many other moments as well that are actually very significant, but we kind of neuter them of their power in our lives. Like your son gets his car and we hand over the keys and there's your vehicle and your license. Okay, knock yourself out. Well, that's much more significant, obviously. Even if the only evidence of its significance was its impact upon you, we ought to acknowledge that as significant and not sterilize or neuter that moment.
I really, Andrew, like those words because they're visceral, and I think they start to get to the level of disconnect in our society, within our families. We dry it out, like all the juice is sucked out of the transition or the rite of, there's maybe some surface level something, but the soul of it is lost. It's logistics.
Yeah, and another word that comes up is it's become more transactional than it is what? What would be the...
Transformational.
Yes. Bam, we got some good pairing of words here. I like these a lot. Mm-hmm. Ritualized to sterilized and transactional to transformational. And before we lose the thread, you mentioned what our conversation allowed you to avoid, which was a less productive or engaged way.
It's like repressed energy too, right? It's like trapped energy. The ritualization, the rites, the ceremonies, the structure of those, they release the energy. They let it transform. They let it move forward into the next stage of human development. I mean, of course, there's a reason why they've been around for thousands of years. It wasn't primitive, cultures doing something silly. It was something deeply human and needed for full potential, and we've deleted it.
I was on a recent episode talking to Dr. Frederick Tate, who spent a career in mental health and hospice and palliative care, and he was commenting how cultures that we would call less civilized by modern standards in terms of, access to health care and paved roads and things like that, are in fact much more civilized in their relationship to death, because they've maintained these symbols of death and dying. They've maintained rituals around death and dying, and it's a part of life for them. And I think it may just be because some of the channels I'm tapped into in the places and people that I listen to, but it seems as if there's a deep longing for a return to the symbols and the rituals that attend to these things and the passages or the passage of life, and just deep longing for it. I think there's a return to it as well. We've an awareness that we've so sterilized ourselves that it's doing harm, and now we need to return to some of the richness and I think mystery is a pretty good word too, surrounding these transformations.
Yeah, I was going to say, and if Joseph Campbell was here or Carl Jung, they would be talking about the numinous aspect of all of this. So the sacredness, the activation of a deeper spirituality, literally spirit level of all of this. It goes beyond any one religion or any one custom. It is, again, deeply human need to be connected to generations, to be connected to human over the millennia of just this process of different aspects of our lives. It is very much the reason why the hero journey, the archetypes are, it's because this shows up culture after culture, millennia after millennia, this need.
What has your awareness of the transformation that was occurring within you, how has that allowed you to show up differently with your son as he enters into this new phase? What have been the fruits of that?
Yeah, one, after our coaching and my insights and just settling in and integrating a little bit, I was able to notice my less stellar parenting tendencies of when I get controlling or getting all up in his business and a little helicoptering. And so I was able to tell him, hey, I think we need to go for a walk and reset our relationship. And clearly we're in a new phase, but we're using the old model and it's not working for either of us. So instead of maybe moving into defiant behavior and, rebellion, we were able to take a walk and I shared what I was feeling and going through. And he said, what he would like from me going forward. And the way he put it was, I absolutely want you there as a mentor or guide or a coach, but not so much telling me what to do or nagging me or in the little details. I am far from perfect, so I err and slide back sometimes, but we were able to literally both move into a more age-appropriate connection and relationship.
That's so cool. And it's interesting that he offered that he didn't want to be told what to do in the same ways that he might have experienced earlier in his life, which to me just indicates the fact that whether or not we observe rites of passage at the moments in time at which it's appropriate to do them, the individual is nonetheless moving down that path developmentally.
It's happening regardless.
Right. And so let's make something of that. Let's acknowledge that moment.
You got to channel that force of energy that is, it's like if you don't repot that plant when it's growing out of the pot, things break, things wither, there's problems. So in a way, I might be stretching the metaphor, but in a way, these rites of passage allow the human beings to be in the next size of to do the development they're meant to do. Otherwise, you're blocking the growth, you're trapping the energy. And you and I had talked about why gangs are so attractive, because they are offering some clear rites of passage. And otherwise that energy, it has to go somewhere. So if there isn't any other rites of passage being offered up, and we could probably point that out in a lot of different areas of the world and life, of you lose religion, you lose meaning, you lose rituals, ceremonies. What do you have? Sterilized, neutered society.
And there are plenty of places where rites of passage can be found on the more destructive side in gang life, and sometimes in fraternities. It depends on the nature of the rite of passage that they institute. But what a shame for folks to have to go find a rite of passage and never to have been given rites of passage along the way with those who are closest to them and who want the best for them, because not everyone or everything out in the world has good intentions for kids, or has intentions that can be as single-minded or as pure as a parent's or a grandparent's or an extended family member's.
It makes me think of when my son graduated from 8th grade. Unfortunately, that was spring of 20. So his school every year would do what they called the ride, RIDE, of passage. And the 8th grade class would take this, 30, 40-mile bike ride to this campground on the coast here in California. And they would all spend the night, and then they would ride back. And so that was the passage from 8th grade. But what I was so struck by is he'd look forward to this for 2 years, all through 7th and 8th grade. COVID hits March. There's no rite of passage in May. That's all shut down. And I saw not only all the other things that were negative about that shutdown, complete shutdown period, but missing out on some of those rituals and ceremonies that were very thoughtfully crafted by his school. He was less. He was developmentally hindered. That and many other things as a result of COVID, but the missed rituals and rites of passage. My dad died at the end of 20 in December. And in the last 24 hours, they let us in to hold his hand. And of course, he's unconscious at that point. But we missed all of the rites of passage, literally, to shepherd him in his dying. And I would say myself and my mother and my sister were developmentally hurt and blocked by that because we didn't have that opportunity. So when we not only don't offer but we take them away as a society, super dangerous.
And that's an interesting connection just with the mortality mindset that I hadn't considered before, is when we so sterilize the transitions in our life that even death, in extreme circumstances, but we allow
it just to be a medical thing.
Yes. It's a medical transaction. It's nothing more than that. Then my goodness, what damage is done.
No transformation possible.
And I think it just brings to the fore again how hyper obsessed, maybe generalizing, but I think it's a reasonable generalization to say we've become with the preservation of life. And there's whole fields of research. And I don't know much about these fields of research and the people in them, but I imagine there's good-willed, well-intended people doing this work. But it seems as if the whole field of longevity research is sort of predicated on this idea that it's good to just continue living, and we ought to live as long as we can and do everything we can to just continue living. And that strikes me as potentially really backwards and counter to the human condition and what we actually need. In my own life, as I contemplate how do I manage the tension between quality of life and length of life, more and more I tend to favor quality of life, understanding that I can't ultimately control length of life, but to be hyper-focused on length of life means that I'm a little bit less engaged today, in this day, the only day I've got, than I otherwise could be. So I hadn't really seen that connection between our hyperfixation on preserving life and the lengths to which we're willing to go that end up sterilizing these. And you'll never have the opportunity to be by your dad's bedside again as he's dying. You cannot recapture what was lost there. Now you're left to try and figure out what to do with the energy that, as you put so well earlier, had to go elsewhere. And because it didn't have the opportunity to be ritualized in ways that would have been more productive, now you're left to figure out what to do with that energy.
Well, and that makes me think about the link between addictions of various types, talk about energies that have to go elsewhere. I would argue that there are so many places for rites of passage. My addiction to alcohol, which has been in abeyance for 17 years now, I would say that started probably in high school, the seeds of it, because of the lack of rite of passage at that time into womanhood, so instead it was all very self-destructive behaviors and things, because there was no real processing and holding of, wow, you've changed into a woman, you're starting high school, you're driving a car, you're able, to concretize and give shape and substance and place for that. So then where does it go? All kinds of other places. Is it one of the laws of thermodynamics that energy is neither created nor destroyed? It's just transformed. Mm-hmm. And that's true emotionally for us as well. And so let's continue to figure out how to channel these energies in the most productive ways. And in my brief browsing online about rites of passage in preparation for our conversation today, I came across a quote that I love from Michael Meade. He's not someone I know, but evidently he's done work in this area. Some of you may know him. From 1993, he said, "If the fires that innately burn inside youths are not intentionally and lovingly added to the hearth of community, they will burn down the structures of culture just to feel the warmth." And I shared that quote with you before you got on the air, and we both just kind of went,
right? Yeah. I mean, yes.
That's it exactly.
I hope today that you and I are making a case to the listeners for those who are realizing that they haven't been giving enough attention to marking these moments of transition that are occurring, whether or not we commemorate them, whether or not we honor them. The movement forward is occurring. So let's help the energy associated with that movement be channeled in the most productive ways for the initiate and for the family in which they live, the community in which they live, the culture in which they live, the society at large, so that at least that person and those around him or her can have as enjoyable and fulfilling a life as possible. But also just thinking about the ramifications for culture at large, when we've got billions of people on the planet for whom these rites of passage energies have not been managed well. And that energy, I think we've made a compelling case, is going elsewhere. I mean, this is world-changing kind of stuff. This is not just, dipping our toes back into the mist of the past to revive some old ceremonies just because it's fun and cool.
Mm-hmm. This is current, present need.
Yeah. The big aha for me when we were talking about this during our coaching conversation was, and this may not be an aha for other people, but it sure was for me, because we talked through it. And the reason it stuck out to me was because your son's passage into an independent driver had impacted you so deeply. I went, well, no crap. I mean, it has to be that part of the benefit of celebrating a rite of passage in a public way is to allow everyone to transition. So, imagine how many kids are on therapeutic couches these days because their mom or their dad or their caregiver or all of them failed to transition them into adulthood and wanted to keep them as little kids because the parents were never given the opportunity or were willing to take the opportunity to transition with them.
Or even told, hey, this is a transitional moment. This is what's supposed to happen here. As a parent, there are all the books of, okay, at this stage, they should be walking, they should be talking, all gives you that. Even though they try to touch on it, there's still not enough of, here's the rite of passage that should be happening at this age and stage. But not just for our kids, all the way through for us as grownups, for, transitioning from other aspects of womanhood, of when you go become menopausal as a woman, there should absolutely be a rite of passage for that. And I keep coming back to, Andrew, the transactional versus transformational. So many of the rituals we've kept, like a wedding or a baby shower, so often they're just about the dance or birthday. It's just about the gifts, the presents, the hoopla, the how much money did we spend? How fancy does it look? Was it Instagram worthy? What? Oh my God, could it be any more sterile and neutered of the actual purpose and meaning and significance?
Yeah, we've mistaken the form for the essence and the icing for the cake.
Yes.
And made it all about that. And then when, things don't go according to plan, the weather turns, the outdoor wedding's ruined, the bride falls in a mud puddle, the whole thing is ruined on occasion.
Because it was all the form. It was all the surface.
Right. And as you were thinking about different transitions that we might honor beyond just those of a young person moving toward adulthood, I thought of midlife. I'm one of those. I'm 48, and midlife has been, challenging to say the least. And I think most people who have passed through these years would say that there had some unique challenges. And how cool would it be if we were able to ritualize midlife, not just grown as we see it approaching and then just sort of muck our way through it until we finally emerge, hopefully a little bit more mature. But, and how many, stereotypically, it seems like it's men who about 44 or 45 blow up their families in dramatic fashion and buy a Ferrari and get a bimbo on a bungalow on the beach and all that kind of stuff. And, how many men would maybe not take those steps if midlife was ritualized for them and recognized as an honorable stage rather than the time when potentially your life falls apart and you get a gut and your health goes to crap and all the things that I think are more commonly associated with midlife.
Well, and why people at that age and stage find their way to, our door and, our coaching couch, if you will, if there was such a thing, of, that desire. I got to process some of this. Who am I now? What happens next? How do I want to be? And so I think as coaches, we inevitably maybe without fully owning it and realizing it, providing that ritualized space, providing rites of passage. That's really striking me at the moment. So we're a celebrant in a way.
I've done this with clients on occasion when the inspiration struck, but I was walking with one on the trail along the river here, as we were accustomed to doing, and I realized that she had had a significant internal transformation that was evident only to her and to me, because I'd been privy to it and a partner in the process. And we stopped along the trail and I said, you know what, let's build a monument. We're in the Rocky Mountains, so cairns of rocks are a common thing to see on trails, and there were rocks along the trail. And I said, what about these rocks? Just make a cairn right here. And it's not going to be here forever, but it's going to be here for a little while. And you and I can see that we stopped in this moment to acknowledge the transformational work that you've done and the changes that you've made within yourself. And it was fun to see her kind of go, what? Well, yeah, okay. And then she really enjoyed the process.
And feel that hands-on, the creative, makes me think of back when I was doing my master's in psychology. I had an internship and a thesis. So both my internship and thesis was around using a type of therapy called sand tray, kind of like art therapy, but it's a little mini sandbox with all kinds of stuff you can put in it, like different characters and objects. And it was all around addiction recovery. And so it just really made me remember when someone creates a sand tray and then it's going to be taken apart that same moment, but you can take a picture of it. They are ritualizing. They are coming to a moment of transition, of creating with their hands those pieces. And it's probably why artists create, why Picasso had different phases of his art. He didn't do the same thing all the time because he transitioned, he transformed into his next level through his art of what every time he painted, it was another moment, another rite of passage in a sense. So I think you're pointing to the importance sometimes of you can't just think it, talk it. Sometimes there are rites that need to be created, hands-on.
The Old Testament and the Christian Bible, the ancients were forever stopping and building altars. Often it was an altar of sacrifice, but and they would stop, they would build an altar, and then they would name the place. And sometimes they would return to that place, if I remember correctly. And the ancients' wells were places that were of significance too. This was Joseph's well. I think Joseph had a well, but so this has been around for a long time. And again, it's a way in which we, quote, civilized moderns maybe ought to begin taking a page from the playbook of the ancients and returning to these practices. Again, it's not just about fanciful, mystical,
superstitious belief or something.
They were onto something. Yeah.
Again, deeply human.
I think at the heart of this topic is really the importance. Rites of passage is one phrase to use, and that seems, I think, to attach to more significant passages from thing to thing, from childhood to manhood or womanhood to marriage to on and on. But I think we're really just talking about creating memorable moments to acknowledge and catalyze life transitions. Because I think there are at least those two elements. We're acknowledging the transition.
And transformational moments. Yeah, it's moving from one stage, internal stage, to your next stage.
And I think that acknowledgement becomes the catalyst for forward movement into the next thing.
It's what allows it, enables it, empowers it to happen.
It was amazing. I was talking to my wife, Karis, about the rite of passage that I want to create for our older son. And I was telling her how much it would mean to me to be able to say, son, I'm now moving you, graduating you from boyhood into young manhood. And we both started crying. We just immediately were possessed with the emotion of what that meant for us as parents, because we were voluntarily, even though we weren't experiencing the rite of passage in the moment, the emotions came to us because we became aware of what it feels like.
You tapped into it. You connected to that, to the energy of it.
Well, we became aware in that moment that we had to transition with him, and that there was something that we were going to grieve and lose, and that it was necessary for us to grieve and lose that. And in doing so, we would then free ourselves to be the parent to him that he needed us to be in the next stage. And I was just so struck that here I was, my wife and I spontaneously crying, just considering administering that kind of an experience for our son. So clearly there's something here.
So we don't stay trapped in the past. We're like left behind. and we're not moving with the flow of life, the transitions of life, how much we cling to, with the whole mortality piece of, instead of embracing, okay, it's starting to happen. Let's really be here. Let's really move through it so that we all can continue.
Yeah, the circle of life, to quote. Who said that in The Lion King? I don't know.
The monkey guy.
Right.
Who was a celebrant, who was a shaman,
who was a celebrant, perfect.
Right.
And I mean, there's so many topics branch off of this, don't they? The place of faith and spirituality and ritual within that context, and our ability to appeal to a higher presence or power. I mean, there's so many things that are tied into this, and I think we're only beginning to scratch the surface.
I mean, we could talk about this all day long.
And you and I would, and the audience would probably get
yes.
maybe like another metaphor, please. What do you think needs to be added to this conversation to make this conversation, just a little bit more complete? What are we missing?
Well, it's my coaching hat, of course, comes back on. Okay, all you listeners, what's coming up for you? What rite of passage do you need in your life? What's the first step you're going to take? I mean, and for you and for me as well, I never just want to talk about it. In the end, I'm like, what are we all going to go do? What are we going to change? What can you change in your school? What can you change in your company? What can you change in your family, your community? So that's what I would want to add to the conversation, is that call to action of, please look for where you need less transaction and more transformation. And may we all carry forward at a more significant, meaningful level.
Perfect. And it also brings to mind, some of you are realizing that there were rites of passage that didn't occur for you that, as Amy said earlier, left you a little bit developmentally challenged. And what are one or two of those for you, and how can you recreate a rite of passage for yourself that will allow you to move beyond that moment and into the present and the future more powerfully? I don't know what that might look like, but I bet all of us could think of a couple moments in our lives when either a time wasn't commemorated or a sacred moment was mishandled by people who were important to us, and it left a wound. And some of that can be therapeutic work, but I bet there are ways that just in the revisiting of those moments, you could come up with a way to celebrate that in your own life. If you have a trusted partner, maybe it's a spouse, partner, therapist, coach, mentor, just someone who could assist you in that would be useful.
Spiritual leader,
to help yourself get unstuck from those moments in the past where you remained stuck. Well, I love this conversation, and I hope it's helped our listeners. What does this have to do with becoming the people we were made to be and living the lives we were made to live, and living with guts, gusto, and abandon? I hope we've made a case that it has everything to do with that maybe relearning or learning for the first time how to commemorate these significant transitions in our lives is essential. It's really a must-have, not a nice-to-have, if we're going to live into our full potential as humans.
Oh God, be a healthy, whole society.
Healthy, whole society, not just a healthy, whole person. So I hope we've made a case that it has everything to do with that, and you'll consider how good a place rites of passage have in your own life. And if you find that it can be improved, then you'll take some steps to do so. So everybody remember, you are going to die, but you're not dead yet. So get after it. Where in your life have transformational moments become merely transactional? Where in your life have you sterilized that which should be ritualized? What parts of you are developmentally delayed because a rite of passage was either neglected or mishandled in the past? How could a rite of passage help you acknowledge and catalyze a transition you're currently experiencing? How could a rite of passage help one of your kids transition well from one stage to the next? In my own case, I'm aware that a midlife rite of passage might be in order. There's much simmering beneath the surface that needs expression or transformation, I think. Maybe some of that trapped energy that Amy brought up. I want to embrace my stage of life even more fully and move forward with guts, gusto, and abandon. But I think in some ways I'm still mourning what I'm leaving behind. I wonder if I'm stuck emotionally and developmentally, and if a rite of passage could help. I don't have a clear next step yet, but it's on my heart and mind. And frankly, on the one hand, it feels easier to just keep trudging ahead without giving this any attention. On the other hand, though, I don't think that's the best way forward if I want to move into the next stage of my life with as much freedom, guts, gusto, and abandon as possible. That's me. What about you? Are you feeling stuck or needing help making a transition in life? Connect with me on Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn at Andrew Petty Coach, or email me at andrew@digdeepwinbig.com. I'm so glad you tuned in today. Don't forget to follow this show, and I'll see you next time on Andrew Petty is Dying.